What causes language to change?
You may catch that in your research and go, I have no idea what they're talking about.
And it has major implications.
Get it right from the start.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kim Larson.
Hi, my name is Aaron Cruikshank. I am the president at CTRS Market Intelligence. When you look at different groups that are out there, different demographics, different populations, there's always going to be what we call in-groups and out-groups, right? So your in-group is a group that is your community. It's the people that you consider your people. And an out-group is everybody else. So often we see in groups protecting their culture, protecting their membership of that group by couching certain things in unique language. So in professional circles, we see that, say engineers. So engineers will come up with overly flowery language for something that could easily be explained with layperson language, but say, well, it's a this or it's a that, and you're going, oh, okay, I guess I know what that is. And lots of professions are guilty of that and putting up walls of language around what they do. But we also see it in cultural groups. So there's been a lot of research done over the years about code switching. And if you're to talk to anybody in the African American community, they talk about this a lot, where amongst themselves, they will use language that's unique to the African American community, but then in a professional setting like work or dealing with members of the public, they might switch to something that's more a vernacular that's more common to the area that they're in or the profession that they're in. Young people do it as well. So, I have kids and they're teenagers, and some of the stuff that comes out of their mouth, I know some of those words, but some of it I have to Google later and go, what does that mean? But this is, again, something that in groups do to protect themselves, and they'll put up walls of language to keep out groups out. And so the context of what setting are you in, who's in that room, is going to affect what code people are using when they're speaking.
In the employer-employee dynamic, because there's that innate power difference, there's an increased incentive for creating euphemisms and talking around topics. There's a lot of implied meaning based on other conversations that are kind of seeding their way into employer relationships. On YouTube, there was a procedure put in place to prevent misinformation around the virus at its peak of curiosity and uncertainty. YouTubers who were talking about the pandemic and the implications on other industries, they had to talk around the word to prevent getting demonetized and penalized for spreading misinformation, even if they were talking about something independent of the pandemic itself. They were talking about impact on the gaming world or conferences where the virus was a factor, but it wasn't the topic. And so they came up with their own euphemisms here. When we're talking about censorship, there's only so many ways people can creatively spell a censored word. And by inserting a brand name, that can, depending on how big that brand is, that can effectively prevent that censorship from happening, right? Netflix is not going to allow or do any, they're going to do what's in their influence or power to say, don't censor our brand name.
TikTok is a very popular channel for content creators to push out teasers, right? So they want to lead people to their main content hub, which might be YouTube or something else. But a good example is comedians, stand-up comedians. So a lot of stand-up comedians are trying to hawk their wares and get people to come out to their shows through TikTok, which then gets redistributed on things like Reddit and other platforms. But because of the heavy restriction platform, and as you can imagine, a lot of comedians are talking about R-rated topics, they have to censor themselves on the platform. So you get people trying to work around censorship blocks, and this can create language differentiation as well, because then it sort of takes on a life of its own and people start referring to it as that because, well, that's how we're talking about it on TikTok. So therefore, that's the word that we're going to use for that now. And if you haven't been on TikTok and you're not wise to the censorship workarounds, you may catch that in your research and go, I have no idea what they're talking about.
So whenever we are in an environment where there's an adversive or penaltive kind of setup versus a positive incentive setup, we'll see people, because they're still going to talk about the thing that they want to talk about. It's just a matter of how quickly can you adapt, and are you going to outpace the adaptation, and if so, for how long? Because it's not a permanent fix, right? There's not going to be an ontology of all the creative ways that people can spell things. Disruptors, language changes when it's not necessarily controversial, it's not necessarily because of a censorship crackdown.
So I didn't invent the term PESTLE, but we adopted it. It's really an acronym that stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. So in our work, whenever we're looking at an issue, we try to scan through the implications or the context, to go back to your earlier point, of where does the situation or where does the population that we're studying touch on these areas, right? PESTLE shock is when you have a major event that happens in one of these 6 categories that is a huge disruptor in the way people live, the way that we operate. So we would say like a big socioeconomic change as a result of one of these PESTLE shocks. So I can give you some examples, so in political, we've seen globally the rise of populist politics, right? So we could say has implications, right? That has implications for policy, which impacts the way that we live, the things we're allowed to do, who we're allowed to love, those kind of things. Recently with all the legislation around anti-abortion laws in the US, I'm seeing a lot of activity on social networks where women are saying to other women, hey, if you want to go camping in the next state over and you want somebody to go camping with you, let me know. I will drive you to go camping and make sure that you get there safely. Economic, we have current economic challenges that are the result of post-pandemic inflation and things like that, where we have increasing numbers of folks in what would have traditionally been the middle class going to food banks and facing housing insecurity. On the social side, I would say changes in work patterns as a result of COVID. So we've got more people working from home, increased focus on health and safety, those kind of things. What do people care about really is the social side? What are people willing to fight for? What are people willing to put their money towards? Technological, we've seen a lot of growth in the last few years in electric vehicle technology, how far they can drive, what they can do. In the legal sphere, for example, you've got case precedents now coming out from work from home. So employment laws are having to be adapted to accommodate folks who, were, let's say, hired on and said, oh yeah, you can, this job is remote. And then suddenly the employer goes, no, we've decided everybody has to come back to the office 2 days a week. Well, that's actually breach of contract. So employment law is having to change, as well as there's some data privacy concerns that we see in the legal spheres as well around work from home and all that kind of stuff. And environmental, this is a funny blanket one because, in the era that we're living in, environmental impacts affects every industry. But, just to pick an example, the last few years in the Pacific Northwest and in Canada where I am, we call it forest fire season, right? In the summer, we get rampaging forest fires that are causing towns to be evacuated and people to lose their homes, and that has huge destabilizing impacts on local economies and even national economies. I think it's worth remembering that as people's lives get more precarious, as these numbers continue to trend upwards, people aren't stupid. They're going to find workarounds and they're going to find new ways to have those needs met, and they're going to use language to describe that is maybe something you're not familiar with.
People have creatively been solving for the problems. And then as those become more normalized, that language is going to need to adapt and evolve to add that differentiation and nuance where previously maybe that nuance had not been necessary or considered. There used to be a pretty limited selection of identity labels at Pride. As people have gotten more nuanced and creating new labels for it in order to communicate more effectively where people stand in their gender and orientation and a whole bunch of other relationship dimensions.
I'm part of this community, and it's the kind of thing where even amongst us, the language is evolving. Like I was at the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce Summit in Denver earlier this year, and a lot of the discussions were around how do we define, I referenced in groups and out groups earlier. So a lot of the discussion at this LGBTQ conference in Denver was around how do we talk about our in groups? How do we talk about our out groups? And there are groups who are currently not officially part of what we call the alphabet mafia. But they're sort of on the fringe, but people are saying, well, maybe we should make room for them. So things like the polyamory community. But these are discussions and debates that are happening inside our in-group. But if you're trying to work with that group from the outside, so you're part of the out group and you want to have good relationships with the in group, you can't decide these things for them. You can't say, well, we define the queer community as this. You have to take the definition that the queer community has for itself, but then that also means you have to find a way to figure out, well, what are they talking about right now? And because the definition, as Kim was saying, changes over time. So being aware or having access to folks in this community that are willing to talk to you about what's going on and is valuable. So, but again, that's more the context. That's doing your homework. That's more of making sure that you have the contextual awareness of what's happening in this community. And this could be any community, right?
This has changed in the last 5, 10, 20, 30 years. Who can buy a house?
Baby boomers sort of had this reasonable expectation, and for most part was realized that if you worked hard, kept your head down, saved your pennies, you could buy a house, retire. Your house would probably be paid off by the time you retire, and that gives you some security in your old age. Now, for people starting families and people trying to put down roots, so the millennials, the Gen Zs now are starting to get into that range. They have a more precarious situation. They can't necessarily afford to buy a house. So they're having to look into alternative living arrangements where you get, say, a larger house and you get 3 or 4 people that co-sign. I think everybody's working towards solutions in the current environment to live securely. Buying a house is great for some, others that's just out of the cards for possibly forever.
There's still the need to be able to afford housing, have social enrichment. And we talked about how relationships are getting restructured. How does Hallmark take advantage of a compersion card for your metamor? If you have never heard of any of those words before, that is fine. The idea of chosen family is not a new idea, but it is an increasingly prevalent one, I think, in some communities more than others. There's an increase in multi-generational housing because childcare is part of that very expensive curve. And multi-generational housing is a form of adaptation similar to the relationship structures. I was surprised to find out that Aaron and I are both aware of folks who have opted out of standard society constructs to the most extreme possible. And the folks have opted out of being that part of that consumer cycle.
Living completely off grid is a very extreme example. And I mean, I think the more common example that we would see is digital nomadism, where you've got folks who make different living choices. Like I had a lady working for me for a while I'm on the Pacific Northwest in Canada. She decided she needed to work from Cambodia for a couple of years and for personal reasons, and that was fine because she had internet access and that was okay. Kim and I were talking earlier about people who do hashtag van life and roam around all over the continent, but with things like improving satellite internet, it's more feasible. You can live out of a Sprinter van and do your work as a customer service rep or as a coder or as a grant proposal writer or whatever it is that you're doing. You can do it living out of a van down by the river now.
Adapting with the evolution. We're putting our brand hat back on to figure out where do we go from here? How do we do it? Things feel like they're changing really quickly. It actually is getting faster, and that is validated. And with the generative AI and how much of that like brainstorming, filling of white space, refinement, all of the things that the generative AI can do for consumers, for employers, this formerly middle class is changed and it is continuing to change. So whether you are deciding to sell to them, employ them, etc., it is increasingly important to be doing the research and not guess. Evaluate the strategy for short-term versus long-term thinking. Are we looking for a quick fix for today's problems? Or are we looking at today's problems in the larger scope of things to determine the best long-term solution to make us a forever company? I think we forget that when we're delivering value and delivering solutions, it is ideally a symbiotic relationship, right? If we're solving your problems, they get value and we get value from solving their problems, right? That is what the capitalism engine is supposed to be doing.
So up here in Canada, we've got the OCAP principles, which are to do with research on Indigenous populations. So increasingly over the years, there have been government agencies and private companies that want to do research on Indigenous populations because they want to serve them better. But these groups sometimes end up being over-researched and don't see a lot of that benefit come back. So especially in health issues, the OCAP principles would say, if you're going to collect data on our population, we need to maintain ownership of that data. That data is about us, so we need access to that data, and we may do some things with it that you don't foresee. So you do health research on that population, they may use that information to decide, well, let's say we build a health center in our community. What kind of services should it offer? Well, based on that data, you could make some more informed decisions. So just because you want to use the data a certain way on a population doesn't mean that data couldn't also be used by that population to do something else with. So the ethical thing is to try to make sure that some of that loops back to them in terms of benefit.
The age of leaving people out should be over or ending soon. The mindset of how do we include more people? And this is both in the research consumer side, but also in the stakeholder side. How do we reach more groups in order to solve more problems in a single effort?
We've been asked in the past to advise government agencies and whatnot on how to best look at their research programs through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And the only real standard that's out there is this bring them in perspective to say, if you're going to do research on a target population that's equity seeking in some fashion, you need to have them involved in the research design phase. And to come back to this loop about language in the future, part of it is, are you using the right language? Are you referencing the right things? It's better to ask that target population and have them tell you. Get it right from the start.
Aaron and I believe that we are primed for this innovation renaissance, right? The circumstances have been changing dramatically enough that with that intensity of either desperation or prosperity, that there's likely going to be a lot of opportunities for things to come out that we've never seen before. Future proof means sustainable. How do we identify as a forever business? It's not necessarily a noun as much as it's a verb. It's an ongoing process or system of doing research, thinking things through. If you have a really niche, weird problem, reaching out to folks like Aaron. If you are an internal research team and you need tools that can adapt at scale dynamically with the language as it's evolving, talk to me and my team, right? We want to help you be that sustainable, future-proof organization. For managers and investors, that is discovering what's right, because oftentimes we don't necessarily know what that is. We may know what it used to be, but as we've kind of emphasized throughout the presentation, that's changing. And then invest in doing that. We can't do it unless we know what it is. That boils down to enhancing your people, whether that is your consumers as your people, your employees and your people, making sure that you're understanding from them what their problems are, what their needs are, what they find reinforcing and what they're going for goes a long way. If you have a data science team, if you have an analytics team, giving them the tools to automate the grunt work. They don't necessarily want to read 20,000 surveys. They can't really read 20,000 surveys. Give them the tools to process it more efficiently. You'll have happier employees. You'll have better research outcomes and all those good things. And that boils down to sustainable systems. And I'm not going to say sign a 3-year contract just to have a 3-year contract, but having that stability in those problem-solving tools can go a really long way. But it really boils down to how well are you adapting and how primed are you to adapt.